Hi everyone, today's going to be a little bit of a different episode. We're actually going to talk about the Canadian real estate market. Now, the Canadian market is kind of known as being a very expensive market internationally. And this led me to be a little bit curious. What is the actual cost of renting versus owning homes across Canada? And I guess the conclusion we can make before we even start the video is that it really depends on where you live in Canada. So without further ado, let's actually shed some light on the Canadian real estate market. First, let's take a look at this graph showing historical home ownership in Canada since 1971. And this is people who own their home outright or have a mortgage. What is interesting to us is that home ownership actually peaked in 2011. It was actually at its lowest level back in 1971 with a rate of 60.3%. We then noticed a large growth in homeownership in the 1990s and early 2000s, and now in 2021 it's on the decline with a rate of 66.5%. This means that 33.5% of Canadians are actually renting, and that renting in general is a trend that's on the rise in Canada, and that is predicted to continue as more and more people decide to live alone. And when you live alone, you're just far more likely to be a renter. And in fact, if you compare this with previous generations, millennials are just far more likely to be renters. And this is specifically people between age 25 and 35. Previous generations were much more likely to already own a home during those years. New construction is also showing us a glimpse into the future. 40.4% of all recently built dwellings since 2016 are tenant occupied, compared with just 28.5% just 5 years ago. We can also see with this next chart that some regions are renting at much faster rates than others. The Maritime provinces and Quebec are leading the way with new construction rentals, whilst Alberta is far below the national average. Now, this is all to say that renting in Canada is just much more popular than it was in the past. And obviously there are other factors that contribute to this, and the main factor being that the market that one finds themselves in will likely determine whether they can actually afford to own or they have to rent. Let's now take a look at this map showing the cost of renting versus owning in different markets across Canada. We immediately notice the uneven distribution of housing costs across the country. The priciest market is, no surprise, Vancouver. Vancouver is actually internationally known as one of the most expensive markets in the world. According to the CREA, the Canadian Real Estate Association, and CBRE, average cost of buying a home in Vancouver as of February 2023 is $1,123,400, and the average rent of a 2-bedroom apartment in the city is $2,160 per month. Now, these are truly insane figures. Imagine being a 25-year-old in Vancouver and you're trying to buy a home. If, assuming you're putting 20% down on a down deposit, which is pretty much typical in Canada, you need around $224,680 for your down deposit, which is ridiculous to think that a 25-year-old would have that type of cash. I mean, this is $250,000. So, the price of owning a home in Vancouver is out of the question for a 25-year-old. So then you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna go renting instead. But renting is the highest in the nation on average. So either way, the cost of housing in a city like Vancouver, and this applies to Toronto as well, is very expensive and way above the national average in Canada. The same can be said for Toronto, although marginally cheaper. Average price of a home in the Canadian metropolis will cost you $1,091,300, while renting will add a monthly bill of $1,920. Not very affordable. Vancouver and Toronto both suffer from similar housing bubbles. Now, if we zoom back out and see the other selected markets, we can see rather low home prices and much more reasonable renting prices across the prairie provinces. Calgary being only slightly higher than the rest, but much lower than Vancouver and Toronto. Moving back east to a couple more Ontarian cities, London and Ottawa have rather expensive markets. Much more reasonable than Vancouver and Toronto, but still outpacing cities such as Calgary. This is not very surprising as Ontario is the growth engine of Canada, and about 1 in 4 immigrants coming to Canada choose Ontarian cities as their destination. What is surprising on this chart though is the province of Quebec. Montreal, being the second largest city in Canada, has a rather cheap market. On average, Montreal home will only cost you about $503,900, while the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment will only hit $1,110 per month. Out of all the cities on this chart, Montreal and Quebec City both have some of the lowest rents, Quebec City being the cheapest place to rent. The province of Quebec in general is kind of just an anomaly in terms of Canadian real estate. Moving on to the Atlantic provinces, and here we find Moncton having the lowest housing costs and the second lowest rents. And finally, we have Halifax, boasting housing and renting costs that are actually similar to Calgary. So as you can see, the choice to either, own a home or rent a home can be very much influenced by where someone lives. And as we've just seen, the numbers are radically different across the nation. So it really depends on where you decided to settle. And you couple that with the new tendency for Canadians to live solo and kind of delay the family construction phase. And it's not really a surprise why renting in Canada is currently booming. And honestly, if you're a young person, between 25 and 35, and you own a home, typically you'll be kind of like the odd one out. Now, I'm not saying that's true for every single market in Canada, but for certain markets, that is certainly the truth. So there you have it, a little insight into the Canadian real estate market. I definitely found it very interesting to see the different numbers across the country. And it's very interesting to see at which points like Vancouver and Toronto are very expensive markets. Now, if we're gonna, get a conclusion out of this video, is the Canadian real estate market a very expensive market? Well, it really depends on where you live. There's some very affordable areas in Canada, and there's some very unaffordable areas in Canada, such as Vancouver and Toronto. So if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and even subscribing to the channel, and even check out the new Instagram I've created for the channel. So if you like Canada and maps, you'll definitely enjoy the Instagram. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ciao guys.